The year was 1878, and the silence of the Dakota prairie was a living thing. For Abigail Hale, it was a shroud she had worn for 2 years, ever since the fever had taken her husband, Walter, and left her the sole occupant of their small, sturdy cabin. The silence was in the walls of the house he had built, in the empty chair across from her at the supper table, and in the vast, unending sky that stretched from one horizon to the other. It was a silence composed of wind and grief, a constant companion that had hollowed her out, leaving behind a woman who simply endured. Her existence was a loop of quiet necessities. She tended the small vegetable garden, its rows a testament to a discipline that bordered on penance. She mended Walter's shirts, though she had no one to wear them, because the feel of the worn cotton in her hands was a connection to a life that had once been full of sound and warmth. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her homestead, a lonely island in a sea of grass. She was a ghost in her own life, moving through the motions with a resilience that felt more like inertia than strength. Her only human contact, spare as it was, came from the Lakota family who lived a half-mile down the creek. Winona, a woman with eyes that held the same ancient quiet as the land itself, and her young son, Chayton. They were specters of a different kind, living on the fringes of a world that was closing in on them. They never spoke much, Abigail and Winona. Their exchanges were a language of gestures, and shared goods: a jar of Abigail's preserves for a bundle of dried herbs, a mended blanket for a piece of supple deerskin. There was a respect between them, a recognition of mutual solitude that transcended the chasm of culture and language. In Winona's steady gaze, Abigail saw not pity, but understanding. One afternoon, as the sun began to bleed orange and purple across the western sky, a different kind of sound broke the stillness. It wasn't the call of a hawk or the rustle of the wind, it was the jangle of bridles and the low, coarse laughter of men. 5 riders appeared over the ridge, their forms dark against the failing light. They were not soldiers or cowboys. They moved with a predatory slouch, their faces obscured by dust and grime, their eyes sweeping the landscape with a proprietary ugliness. Abigail's hand went to the worn handle of the axe leaning against the cabin wall. Her heart, a slow and tired drum, began to beat a frantic rhythm. They bypassed her cabin, their focus clearly on the small, traditional dwelling of Winona and Chayton. Abigail watched from her window, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. She saw them dismount, their movements aggressive and dismissive. One of them kicked at the stretched hide of the home. She saw Winona emerge, her small son half hidden behind her skirts, her posture a column of defiant dignity. The men laughed, a sound that curdled the air. Something inside Abigail, something long dormant and buried under layers of sorrow, broke. It was not courage, not in the way Walter had been courageous. It was a fiercer, more primal thing, an absolute refusal to bear witness to one more violation in a world that had already taken everything from her. She turned from the window, her movements swift and decisive. She went to the chest at the foot of her bed and lifted the lid. Walter's rifle lay there, oiled and ready. He had taught her how to use it, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, his patient voice explaining the mechanism. "Just in case, Abby," he had said. "The world isn't always kind." Her hands did not tremble as she took the heavy weapon. She did not stop to think. To think was to let fear back in. She strode out of her cabin, the rifle held low but ready, the weight of it a strange comfort. The men turned at her approach, their laughter dying into sneers of surprise. There were 5 of them, and their leader, a man with a scarred face and pale, merciless eyes, took a step forward. "Well now," he drawled, looking her up and down. "Look what we have here, a lonely widow come to join the party." "There is no party," Abigail said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is a private home. You will leave these people in peace." The scarred man, who called himself Garrett Vance, chuckled. "These people, you mean the savages? We're just collecting a tax, ma'am. A tax for them living on land that ain't theirs no more. His eyes glinted with a cruel light. "And now, attacks on you for interfering." "They have nothing for you," Abigail insisted, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "Leave, now." Vance's smile vanished. "You're in no position to be giving orders." He gestured to his men. "Get what you can from the hut. I'll deal with the welcoming committee." Two of the men moved towards Winona, who stood unmoving, a shield for her child. Abigail raised the rifle, the motion clumsy but clear in its intent. "I said stop." Vance moved faster than she could have imagined. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his hand lashing out to slap the rifle barrel aside. The force of it sent a jarring shock up her arms. Before she could recover, he was on her. His other hand held a long, wicked-looking knife. He grabbed the front of her dress, pulling her close until she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Brave woman," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Stupid, but brave." Then came the pain. The first stab was a hot, shocking intrusion just below her ribs. A gasp tore from her throat, all the air leaving her body in a rush. He did not stop. The knife was a cold, rhythmic serpent, striking again and again. She felt a tearing sensation in her side, a sharp fire in her shoulder. She saw Winona's horrified face, heard Chayton cry out. She tried to fight, to raise her hands, but her strength was draining away with the warmth that was suddenly blooming across her chest and stomach. The world began to tilt, the vibrant colors of the sunset blurring into a dark, swirling vortex. She registered the pain as a distant fact, a series of 7 distinct, searing violations. Her last conscious thought was one of profound failure. She crumpled to the dusty ground, the scent of her own blood filling her senses before the darkness took her completely. Abigail drifted back to consciousness slowly, like a swimmer rising from an impossible depth. The first thing she registered was not pain, but scent. The aroma of wood smoke and something else, something herbal and pungent that reminded her of the prairie after a rain. She was not in her own bed. The surface beneath her was firm but soft, a bed of furs laid over a willow frame. Above her, the ceiling was not made of wooden planks but of stretched hides, the light filtering through them in a warm amber glow. She tried to move, and a chorus of fire erupted along her side, her shoulder, her abdomen. A low moan escaped her lips. Immediately, a gentle hand was on her forehead, cool and soothing. She forced her eyes open and saw Winona leaning over her, her expression a mask of deep concern. "Be still," Winona said. Her English was soft, accented but clear. It was more than Abigail had ever heard her speak at once. "You have been hurt badly." Abigail's memory returned in a brutal flash. Vance's cruel face, the glint of the knife, the searing pain. "The men," she whispered, her throat raw. "Gone," Winona said, her voice tight. "They took little. They were spooked by what they did to you. They fled." Abigail looked down and saw that her dress had been cut away. Her torso was tightly bound with clean strips of linen, stained in places with dark, dried blood and a greenish poultice that gave off the sharp, clean scent. Every breath was a labor. It felt as though her body was a vessel barely holding itself together. For days, she drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Her world became a small circle of sensations, the taste of a thin, savory broth Winona spooned into her mouth, the coolness of a wet cloth on her brow, the quiet, watchful presence of Chayton sitting in a corner, his dark eyes fixed on her. The boy, who was perhaps 10 years old, was a silent sentinel. He would sometimes leave and return with fresh water or a handful of herbs, his movements deft and purposeful. There was no sound of the outside world, only the hushed, careful sounds within the lodge. In her lucid moments, Abigail was overwhelmed by a profound sense of vulnerability. She, who had prided herself on her stoic self-reliance, was now utterly dependent on the very people she had tried to protect. She could do nothing for herself. Winona cleaned her wounds with a patience that was both tender and terrifyingly methodical. Abigail saw the deep, angry punctures in her own skin, and a wave of nausea and shame washed over her. She had been broken open, laid bare. Yet in Winona's care there was no judgment, only a focused, life-giving duty. One morning the fever broke. She awoke feeling weak, hollowed out, but her mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The pain was a dull, constant ache instead of a sharp, stabbing fire. She saw that Chayton was not in his usual corner. "Where is the boy?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. Winona, who was grinding herbs with a stone pestle, paused. She looked at Abigail, her gaze steady. "He has gone to bring word." "Word?" Abigail was confused. "To whom?" "To our people," Winona replied simply, and turned back to her task. Abigail did not understand, but she was too weary to question it further. She closed her eyes and drifted into a true healing sleep. She did not know that Chayton had ridden for 2 days without stopping, his small body pushed to the limits of endurance, carrying a message not of attack or of loss, but of a debt of blood, given in defense of his family by a woman who was not his kin. A week after the attack, Abigail was strong enough to sit up, leaning against a backrest Winona had fashioned for her. She was sipping a warm, bitter tea when she heard it. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration in the earth. A tremor felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a sound like distant thunder on a clear day. Winona rose to her feet, her expression unreadable, and went to the entrance of their home. Abigail watched, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs, a new kind of fear mixing with curiosity. The sound grew louder, a deep, rhythmic drumming that was the unmistakable beat of hundreds of hooves on hard-packed earth. And then they came. They crested the hill to the east, their silhouettes stark against the bright morning sky. It was not a war party. They moved with a disciplined order, a flowing river of men and horses. There were dozens of them, then more, until the entire ridge was filled. They were a silent, powerful force, their faces painted not for war, but with symbols of purpose and gravity. They carried bows and lances, and some had rifles resting across their saddles. At their head rode a man of imposing stature, his face stern and deeply lined, a single eagle feather tied in his long black hair. At his side, looking impossibly small, rode Chayton. They stopped a respectful distance from the lodge. The air thrummed with their presence. Abigail felt a tremor of fear, the ingrained terror of the stories she had been told about savage warriors. But then she looked at Winona, who stood calm and erect, and she saw Chayton point towards her, towards the lodge where she sat, weak and bandaged. The leader dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He handed his reins to another warrior and walked towards them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of immense authority. He stopped before Winona, inclined his head slightly, and then his gaze fell upon Abigail. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to take in everything at once. Her pale face, the bandages visible beneath her borrowed tunic, the lingering pain in her expression. "I am Tashunka," he said, his voice a low baritone, deep and resonant as the earth itself. "The boy, Chayton, brought word to our council. He told us what you did. He told us of the blood you shed for his mother, for him." Abigail could only stare, speechless. She felt small and insignificant before this man, before the 100 silent warriors who sat on their horses, watching. Tashunka took another step closer. "Our law is old. A debt of blood is the highest debt. You stood as family to defend one of our own. You took wounds meant for them. An act of such honor cannot be met with simple thanks." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her small, vulnerable form. "The council has decreed, the life you saved belongs now to you. The life you risked will be protected. My men and I, we have come to be your guard." Abigail stared at him, trying to process his words. "My guard." The idea was preposterous, overwhelming. I don't understand." I am just one woman. I did only what anyone should have done." "Few would have," Tashunka said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You stood alone against 5 men for a woman and child you barely knew, who are not of your people. In our world, that is the act of a chief, of a warrior. We will honor it as such." He looked back at his men, a silent sea of witnesses. "An enemy to you is now an enemy to the people. This land you live on is now under our protection. You will not be alone again." The days that followed were a strange dream from which Abigail felt she might wake at any moment. The 100 warriors did not crowd her. They were a quiet, unobtrusive presence that transformed the landscape around her. They made their camp down by the creek, their lodges rising like a small, disciplined village. Sentries were posted on the ridges, their silhouettes visible at sunrise and sunset, motionless as statues. The profound, empty silence that had defined her life was replaced by a new kind of quieter living, watchful quiet, filled with the soft sounds of the camp. The murmur of voices in a language she did not understand, the nicker of horses. Her fear of them quickly subsided, replaced by a sense of awe. They were not the wild savages of settler gossip. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply respectful of her space. No one approached her cabin without purpose. One morning, she found a stack of perfectly cut firewood by her door. Another day, a brace of rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot, was left on her porch. She watched from her window as one warrior, seeing a section of her fence had been damaged, spent an entire afternoon meticulously repairing it with nothing but a small knife and some sinew. He never looked towards her, never sought thanks. The work was simply done. Tashunka visited her every day. He would come to her cabin and sit with her on the porch as she slowly regained her strength. At first, their conversations were brief, formal. He would inquire about her health. She would thank him for his men's quiet help. But gradually, the silences between them grew comfortable, filled with a shared understanding. He told her about his people not in long speeches, but in small stories and observations. He pointed out the different calls of the birds, explaining what each one signified. He showed her how to read the clouds to predict the weather. Abigail, in turn, found herself speaking of Walter. She told Tashunka about the way he had loved this land, how he had built their home with his own hands, his dreams of a family that the fever had stolen. She spoke of her loneliness, of the grief that had been her only companion. Tashunka listened without interruption, his dark eyes full of a grave attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not been in years. "The pain of loss is a heavy blanket," he said one evening as they watched the stars begin to appear in the velvet sky. "It can keep you warm, or it can smother you. You have carried it alone for a long time." She looked at him, at the strong, weathered lines of his face, and knew that he, too, understood loss. In that moment, the immense cultural gulf between them seemed to shrink, bridged by the universal human language of sorrow. Her wounds began to heal. The deep punctures became puckered scars, a permanent map of that terrible afternoon etched onto her skin. But as her body mended, something else was mending too. The hollow space inside her was beginning to fill, not with the old grief, but with something new, a sense of belonging. Her small, isolated homestead no longer felt like an island. It felt like the heart of a vibrant, living community. She learned the names of some of the warriors. Wapasha, a young man with a quick smile who was a master carver and left small, intricate animal figures on her windowsill. Kange, an older, silent man who seemed to communicate entirely with his expressive eyes and who always ensured her water barrels were full. This strange new reality, however, did not go unnoticed. News traveled slowly on the frontier, but it traveled surely. In the small, dusty settlement of Providence, 20 miles to the west, whispers began to circulate. The story became twisted in the telling. The widow Hale, attacked and now held captive by a band of wild Lakota. Or worse, she had turned her back on her own kind, become a sympathizer, an outcast living amongst the savages. Fear and prejudice were potent fuels, and the fire of suspicion was easily stoked. One day, a new group of riders appeared on the horizon. This was not a band of outlaws. It was a posse from Providence, led by Sheriff McBride, a man with a hard jaw and eyes that held no room for nuance. They rode with a grim purpose, their rifles held ready. Tashunka's sentries had signaled their approach long before they arrived. By the time the posse reined in their horses 100 yards from Abigail's cabin, they found their way blocked. 50 Lakota warriors stood in a silent, unyielding line, their bows in hand. At their center stood Tashunka, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression impassive. Sheriff McBride's face flushed with anger. "I'm here to see Mistress Hale," he shouted, his voice tight with authority. "We have reason to believe she is being held against her will." Before Tashunka could respond, the door to the cabin opened. Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She was still pale and moved with a slight stiffness, but she stood tall, her shoulders back. The simple cotton dress she wore could not hide the new steel in her spine. "I am quite well, Sheriff McBride," she called out, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily across the distance. The sheriff stared, his composure faltering for a moment. "Abigail, are you safe? Can you speak freely?" "I have never been safer in my life," she replied, her gaze sweeping from the sheriff to the line of warriors and back again. She took a deliberate step forward, walking down from the porch to stand beside Tashunka. It was a clear and unmistakable declaration of allegiance. The men in the posse shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "These men," she continued, gesturing to the warriors, "saved my life after I was left for dead by men of my own color. They have shown me nothing but honor and protection. They are not my captors. They are my guests and my guards." McBride's face hardened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know what you're doing. Harboring 100 hostiles is a danger to the entire territory. I am ordering them to disperse. For your own good." Tashunka finally spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute command. "We are not hostiles. We are here to honor a debt. This woman's safety is our sacred duty. We will not leave her unprotected." "Unprotected from what?" the sheriff scoffed. "From your own kind, I wager." "No," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Unprotected from men like Vance and his gang, the ones who stabbed me 7 times and left me to bleed to death in the dirt. Have you found them, Sheriff? Have you brought them to justice?" McBride was silent. The accusation hung in the air, a stark reminder of his own failure. He had no answer. He knew of Vance, a ruthless outlaw who preyed on isolated homesteads, but he had never had the courage or the manpower to confront him. "I suggest you and your men return to Providence, Sheriff," Abigail said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "There is no trouble here unless you intend to start it." Defeated and humiliated, McBride stared for a long moment at the woman he no longer recognized, standing beside the imposing Lakota chief, flanked by a silent army. He wheeled his horse around without another word, his posse following suit. As they rode away, the dust they kicked up seemed like a retreat. But the confrontation had set something new in motion. News of the posse's failure would travel just as surely as the first rumors had. And it would eventually reach the ears of the only man who had a vested interest in seeing Abigail Hale silenced for good, Vance. He had left her for dead once. Hearing that she had not only survived but was now guarded by an entire tribe would be a loose end he could not tolerate, a challenge to his brutal reputation. The true test was not over. It was only just beginning. The confrontation with the sheriff settled into a tense quiet, but it was the calm before a storm. Tashunka knew it. His sentries became even more vigilant, their watchfulness a constant, humming tension across the prairie. They knew that Vance, a man driven by a venomous pride, would not let the story of his own brutality become a tale of another's survival and honor. He would return, not just to finish what he started, but to obliterate the symbol Abigail had become. The attack came on a moonless night, under a sky so thick with stars it felt like a smothering blanket of diamonds. The first warning was not a sound, but a disturbance, the sudden silence of the night insects, the restless shifting of the horses. A sentry on the western ridge let out the sharp, piercing cry of a nighthawk, a signal that was immediately answered from the other posts. The camp came alive not with panic, but with a swift, deadly purpose. Abigail was inside her cabin, mending a tear in one of Chayton's shirts by lamplight. Winona was with her. At the first signal cry, Winona was on her feet, her face a calm, stoic mask as she extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. "They are here," she said simply. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat, but the terror was different this time. It was not the paralyzing fear of a victim, but the cold, sharp fear of someone with something to protect. She pulled Winona and Chayton, who had been sleeping in a corner, towards the root cellar, the safest part of the house. Outside, the night erupted. Gunshots cracked through the air, their flashes illuminating scenes of frantic, brutal combat. The outlaws, perhaps a dozen strong this time, had tried a surprise assault, hoping to catch the camp unawares. They had profoundly miscalculated. They were not attacking a sleeping camp. They were charging into a meticulously prepared defensive web. From the small cellar grate, Abigail could see flashes of the battle. She saw the Lakota warriors move like shadows, fluid and deadly. They did not fight like soldiers in a line, but like a pack of wolves, flowing around their enemies, striking from the darkness, their war cries a chilling counterpoint to the panicked shouts of the outlaws. The fight was a maelstrom of chaos and precision. She saw Tashunka, a towering figure in the moonlight, moving through the fray not with a rifle but with a heavy war club, his movements a blur of devastating force. The outlaws' attack faltered, their surprise turning into a desperate, losing battle for survival. They were encircled, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. The fight moved closer to the cabin as Garrett Vance, in a final desperate gambit, tried to reach Abigail, the source of his obsession. He broke through the outer ring of fighting, his face a mask of crazed fury, a revolver in each hand. He saw the cabin, his prize, his target, but his path was blocked. Tashunka stood before him, breathing heavily, his expression one of cold, final judgment. "You have brought death to a place of peace," Tashunka said, his voice a low growl. "She's a witch. Got you savages wrapped around her finger," Vance screamed, raising his pistols. "I'll send you all to hell with her." He fired, the shots deafeningly loud, but Tashunka was no longer there. He had moved with a speed that defied his size, weaving to the side. The bullets went wide, thudding into the cabin wall. Before Vance could fire again, Tashunka closed the distance. There was a sickening crunch as the war club connected with Vance's arm, sending one pistol flying into the darkness. Vance cried out in pain and rage, trying to bring his other weapon to bear, but Tashunka was relentless. The fight was brutally short. It ended with Vance on the ground, silenced forever. Slowly, the sounds of battle died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the low, victorious calls of the Lakota. The threat was over. It had been a swift, bloody, and decisive end. When the sun rose the next morning, it illuminated a scene of quiet finality. The bodies of the outlaws had been removed, dealt with according to Lakota custom for dishonorable foes. The tribe was tending to its own. They had suffered losses, 3 warriors had fallen, and several more were wounded. Their deaths were not met with cries of despair, but with a deep, solemn grief, the beginning of rituals that would honor their sacrifice. Abigail emerged from the cabin into the cool morning air, her legs unsteady. The prairie, her home, was scarred by the violence of the night, but it was peaceful now. She saw Tashunka standing alone on the small rise overlooking the creek, his back to her. She walked to him, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It is over," he said, without turning. "Yes," she whispered. "I am sorry for the lives that were lost, for the men who died for me." Tashunka finally turned to face her. His face was etched with weariness, but his eyes were clear. "They did not die for you, Abigail Hale. They died for what you represent. They died defending honor. It is a good death." He looked towards his camp, where the morning rituals were beginning. "The threat from Vance is gone. We have paid the debt of blood in full. You are safe now." A pang of a new kind of loss went through her. Will you be leaving?" He gave her a small, rare smile. 100 warriors are no longer needed to guard one woman. My men have families and duties of their own. Most will return." He saw the shadow cross her face and added, "But this place is now known to us as the home of the honored woman. It is under our watch, always. A small party will remain camped nearby, for as long as you wish it. But more than that," he said, his voice growing softer, "a bond has been made that is not so easily broken. Winona and Chaitan will stay with you if you will have them. You are no longer a woman alone, you are kin." In the weeks and months that followed, a new life took root on the small patch of prairie, a new equilibrium. Winona and Abigail became sisters of the heart, their silences now filled with easy companionship as they worked together in the garden, which was now twice its original size. Chaitan became the son Abigail never had, a bright, curious boy she taught to read and write, while he, in turn, taught her the Lakota names for the stars and the secrets of the land. Tashunka was a frequent visitor, his presence a quiet, steadying force in her life. The armed guard eventually became a small, friendly camp, a bridge between two worlds. The cabin that had once been a monument to grief became a home filled with the sounds of life, the murmur of two languages, the laughter of a child, the sharing of meals. One evening, as Abigail stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky, she instinctively touched the scars on her side. They were a part of her now, no longer just a reminder of pain, but a testament to her own unforeseen strength. They were the price of connection, the mark of a life that had been broken open only to be filled with something far richer and more profound than what she had lost. She looked out at the vast, beautiful land, at the distant, friendly glow of the Lakota campfires under the rising moon. The prairie silence was still there, but it was no longer an emptiness. It was a peace she had earned, a home she had found, not in a place, but in the shelter of an unexpected, honorable, and fiercely loyal family.